This week on the show, Nip win Dreamhack Malmo, Na'Vi get Guardian back, and Freakazoid leaves Cloud9's active roster. I'm Jack Westerman, joined by John Blue Mullen, and we're going to kick things off with a FRAG clip. This week's clip is Fnatic versus MTW at the IEM5 European Championship, where Exist picks up a 4K in the grand final. Fnatic would defeat MTW 2 maps to 1, winning $20,000, while Exist picked up the award for Grand Finals MVP. Our first and only story this week is Dreamhack Malmo, which of course took place in Malmo, Sweden between April 12th and 17th, so pretty much the whole of the last week. Now, this was a $250,000 tournament. First place, I think, took home $100,000, and as we take a look at Group A on screen, this was the group with Luminosity, Tyloo, Liquid and Mouse Sports. Fair to say, Blue, that this tournament got off to a pretty controversial start. We'll talk about Luminosity first, because obviously they were the major winning team and got upset very early on here.
This easily has to be one of the largest, or this has to be like one of the highest concentrations of upsets within just a single tournament in quite a while. And if you just watched last week's episode of PopFlash, all of my predictions specifically just got completely shattered. And it all started off with Group A, where Luminosity gets knocked out of this event by Tyloo of all people. Not just this too, but they also are beat in the first place decider by Mouse Sports easily coming off of this one. Everybody was like, yeah, this group should be easy for them. Mouse Sports had been struggling. They weren't really looking to be a good team, but coming into it, Luminosity, they get dropped by them 7-16, then they go down. They are able to get themselves into that second place decider, of course, but even right there, Tyloo shows up, and it's a team which nobody had any clue would be making it out of the group, since they're just coming in there and managing to pull off the 2-1 upset against them to send them over to the quarterfinals.
Yeah, I wasn't going to mention the fact that all of your predictions came up false, but you brought it up, so we'll go with it.
Got wrecked.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. So Luminosity, they didn't play great. Do we think, are they in kind of a post-major slump? They just won the biggest title ever in CSGO. Do we give them a little slack for this event?
I wouldn't necessarily say slump. I think what a lot of people said, like immediately after this game, where this is one of the problems with Luminosity, is that they're only good against teams which they can prepare for. And Tyloo was a team where they could not really prepare for going against the Mouse Sports as well. I imagine that they thought it was going to be an easier opponent than it actually ended up being. So there might have been some slackage going on there, but normally we don't expect that from these guys. They're prepared for a match that they expected to be tough, but against Tyloo, I think they were expecting an easy match. And with all those tweets you saw where Tyloo was staying up all throughout the night, obviously Tyloo's efforts to counter-strat them worked out much better than Luminosity's possibly non-work in getting ready for that matchup.
So were you impressed with, well, A, Tyloo's work ethic, and B, their performance in game in that case?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, they earned it, definitely. I did not think that, coming into this event, I think they were going to be the first one out. We talked about this last week, about how most of these Asian teams, they're going to need to show a lot more presence in these events. The best thing they're going to get out of it is the experience of going up against some of those bigger teams. But they showed up, they surprised, and they were here. They wanted to make it through, and obviously they put the effort in. We saw that social media and whatnot coming out from them, and they 100% deserved the spot they got in the quarterfinals. It wasn't a fluke at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they definitely worked hard for it. Another team we should talk about here very quickly is Team Liquid, because they, of course, Luminosity won the major, but Liquid were, semi-finalists at the major? So, again, this was a pretty stacked group. Tyloo made short work of them as well.
Yeah, it just seemed like the problems started to resurface with Liquid pretty quickly here. Unfortunately, we saw some good performances coming out from players like. Let me ask. Can you ask that again? Sorry, I got tripped up on myself.
Sure. Okay, note to Yapzilla, because a few weeks ago we had an episode of PopFlash where you and I had like a. Should we ask that again? Yeah, I'll say it again. Note to Yapzilla, we should cut this part out, okay? And another team we should touch on very quickly while we're on Group A is Liquid, because, well, we talked about Luminosity being the major champion, but Team Liquid were a semi-finalist and they got knocked out by Tyloo as well.
Yeah, I mean, showing up to this event, there was definitely players that carried their performance to a certain degree from the major over to this one, but they weren't bringing in a Dren who actually showed quite a bit of promise, and now since it seems like after this event, Sipil's going to be taking some time off and Adren's stepping back on. Maybe we could see some changes there. But Elige was probably the player that dropped off by quite a large amount. He had been an absolute star performer, at least in that match versus Fnatic at the Major, and we just didn't really see it here at all, at least versus Mouse Sports. They managed to bow 13-25 with a 0.53 player rating, so didn't really see too much from him. A lot of the individualistics dropped off, and the team just really did not seem as cohesive as they were back in Columbus.
All right, well, let's jump over to Group B next. This was the group with Na'Vi, Godsent, Cantologic Gaming, and G2. And first off the bat, we've got Na'Vi. They're kind of sweeping their way through the group. 2 wins in quick succession, even though they were playing with Starix. It's worth mentioning that Guardian was out with a hand injury for the duration of the group stage. Wasn't really noticeable. I think it's fair to say, Blue, they played pretty well.
No, the rest of this team, I mean, you just look at Navi's performance overall, looking, I would say probably a 6-month period is a good point of time to look at it, where we've slowly shifted from Guardian just being 100, like, well, maybe not 100%, but like 90% of the fragging power for this team.
Yeah.
And then that slowly changed more and more over the past couple of months. Flamey's been stepping up big time, and a lot of the other players like Seized as well had some pretty big performances at this tournament. Flamey has evolved a lot, but now we're starting to see some of the other guys step up big time. So it's not really just, I think the intro for the team at Malmo said something along the lines of far away from a one-man show now, and that's definitely the truth with Navi.
Yeah, absolutely. Though, I mean, speaking of a one-man show, Starix, who was the team's coach, of course, stepped in, and he actually led the team in their match against Godsent. He had the highest kill-death ratio and player rating. He was plus 12 and 1.52. That's a massive player rating. It definitely helps to have an ex-player as your coach, clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, when they just step in, doesn't hurt, of course, when those rogue hand injuries come to show their ugly faces.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about another North American team that didn't show up. I know you American guys always like answering questions like this, right, Blue? So, CLG, they made light work of G2, but then, of course, missed out on that first place decider against Na'Vi, and then bombed out versus Godsent. They got swept 2-0. Given how close they got against Na'Vi, you know, they went into overtime. Do you think, you know, the blow of almost winning first place but missing out, do you think that weighed on their minds at all in that second place decider? What do you chalk that up to?
I think it's a possibility. Like here's the thing with CLG, and I know this is going to sound rather cliche because this is an excuse that's tossed out so often, but I think, in all honesty, just when you look at stats and the way that the games have played out and the way that correlates to the individual stats, CLG in this event was a team that was based so much on how the early game went and how much momentum, there's that cliche part, that they are able to carry into the match. You look at the stats versus G2, and there's people that showed up and performed absolutely wonderfully. Specifically, I'm looking at Hazed and Cutler, who had amazing games there, and this is because they get the ball rolling so early against G2, and G2 is just never able to bounce back from it, so it's easy pickings for those guys, and of course they're in a great mood, they're able to frag very easily. Then you go down to Na'Vi, and it's a trade battle back and forth. These guys are fighting for control of the matchup very early on in it, and they never really get themselves off to a very solid lead, so that's where the nerves start to come in. They're never really able to get a large amount of momentum going, and immediately you look at the bottom of the scoreboard for that matchup, and, well, it was 2 of the guys that were at the top in the previous one. Hazed and Cutler, unfortunately, did not perform very well at all. 0.68, 0.66 rating, so it just seems to be a trend there. And I think, yes, to answer your actual question there, when they go into that actual final, the fact that they got that close and didn't make it through definitely is going to weigh on their minds. There's a lot of negativity, I imagine, that's coming into the team comms at that point. And overall, I don't think they themselves maybe were expecting to make it out of this group at that point anyway. I know I really wasn't expecting to see them come out of it, so it wasn't too big of a surprise to see them actually drop out at the end of the day.
Yeah, and drop out they did, which means that Na'Vi and Godsent were the 2 teams to advance from Group B. Taking a look at Group C, we'll see this was the group with Astralis, CSGO Lounge, Dignitas, and Ninjas in Pajamas. And yet another prediction of yours that did not come true. I think last week on PopFlash you said, Astralis are a sure bet to make it out of the groups. I
think everybody would have said that. I think everybody would have said that, to be fair.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't blame you. But they did bomb out for the first time, I think, ever in the group stage of a major well, not a major, but a really big tournament like this. What went wrong for the Danes here?
I don't think that in this matchup it was definitely their defenses obviously having a pretty bad time compared to what they're normally used to. But I think a lot more of this was Nip's sort of power that they bring to this one, and Nip's improvements over the past couple months. We had seen this already online in the ESL Pro League and the other various online leagues that they may have been playing in, that there was definitely a large increase as to their potential.
Yep.
And this was all coming back because of Threat joining the roster. We've seen the improvements that have made because of that, and these guys have been praising Threat because of how much he's changed for this team. But I think this is the first LAN, the exception of the first matchup, of course, but this is, I think, the first LAN where that really started to show, and that ultimately, I think, caught Astralis completely off guard, and it was able to swipe by them in that last place decider for that group.
People do praise Threat quite a bit, and he's getting all this credit for his hand in this win for Nip. What changes have you noticed in game? I mean, what are the practical things that he's changed for this roster?
I think overall we're just seeing a much more confident Nip than we have in the past. Previously, Nip just didn't really seem like a team that was very confident at all with their sort of strats and whatnot. Now we're starting to see them really come out of their shell a lot better. And this is not only increasing the team's overall performance, but the individuals, now that they're able to get a consistent string of rounds going together because the strategies have grown in their potency. These individuals obviously are going to feel a lot better about themselves, maybe taking more risks, and some flashier plays start to pop out as well.
Yeah, and of course it's always nice when players like GetRight and Forest show up to a tournament, right?
Yeah, definitely.
They've had their struggles in the past. So that was Group C. So, excuse me, Dignitas and Nip advanced from there. And, of course, we'll come back and talk about Nip very shortly. Moving on to Group D, last of the 4 groups, nearly on the home straight. We've got FaZe, Virtus.Pro, Tempo Storm, and Envious. And, well, straight off the bat, let's take a look at FaZe, because they lost 16-8 to Virtus.Pro and then got eliminated by Envious, which, you know, not the best route through the tournament for these guys. Your thoughts, Blue? How do you kind of feel about this pickup of Kiyoshima that they made?
I think, first of all, with how quickly this seemed to have come along after the major, and especially when you look at like how all of a sudden, it seems to me at least, I know other people in the scene may have more intel as to why exactly that happened, but with Makalele just seeming to suddenly be kicked off the roster, I didn't think that spirits were going to be very high at all coming into this event for FaZe, so I don't think they themselves, once more, were really expecting to go that far. Bit surprising to see them get knocked out by Envious, though, of all people, who probably had the worst tournament of all, like that. Like, just when you look at the scale of what they've gone from for being the champions to last place in one major sequence there, I thought that, again, we were going to see those problems, but Envious, although they didn't really end up making it too far beyond the actual bracket, still came into this one and were able to make it much further than they did in the majors. So credits to them for that one. That was probably the biggest surprise for me in the FaZe's path on this tournament, is that they actually got knocked out by Envy.
Yeah, absolutely. And another team we talked about last week was Tempo Storm. They're a team we haven't seen at a big international event for a while. Yeah. Did we get the performance we were hoping for from the Brazilians?
I don't think so, actually. Again, the 2-0 that ends up happening here, like I said, especially with the somewhat poor shape that Envious had been in the past, I would have thought the Tempo Storm would have been able to sneak through here and add another Brazilian team to the quarterfinals. But it turned out in this tournament that neither of them would actually end up making it through. The Velocity story, of course, is a little bit more dreadful, but here, Envious definitely, as we were just talking about, Envious definitely stepped up previously from what we saw at the major. And Tempo Storm, despite their best efforts, there was definitely some good attempts that they just weren't able to get past the French this time around.
Absolutely. Well, at least balance has been restored and the European teams are back on top. I'm not complaining.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's jump down and take a look at the playoff bracket. As we take a look here, you know, we've talked about a lot of these teams already. Na'Vi, Tyloo, Dignitas, Envy, all these guys made it through. And in these initial quarterfinal games, there are a lot of 2-0 results. Na'Vi up there at the top beat Tyloo 2-0 and then advanced to the semi-finals where they beat Envious 2-0. However, is it fair to say Guardian, who was back on the roster at this point after being cleared with that hand injury, wasn't quite looking as aggressive as usual?
I definitely think that's the case. He definitely needs to take things a little bit more cautiously, I feel, not only because of his injury. I mean, you could see it. I think he had that athlete's tape on his arm to make sure the muscle doesn't get as strained.
Yeah.
We saw him rolling with that style in it, I guess you could say. And I think he talked, I don't know if it was happening in this tournament or if he did it at the major, but I think he had to change his sensitivity up so that when he makes flicks, it's done more with his his wrist or something instead of his arm, which is I forget exactly how it worked out.
Right.
A bit confusing. I've never had those problems myself. But I know he changed something so that he could move an area of his hand that wasn't hurting as much. So I think with that, he's just adjusting his playstyle in general with that. Where previously, of course, he could take all these risks because he's 100% comfortable with himself and his own playstyle. Now he's changed it up to a very large degree. So I think that in general is going to lead to him being a much more passive player while he's still in that transition phase.
Yeah, I think during the major or after the major, he came out and said he'd upped his sensitivity to 4, right? Or he's playing with 4 times his usual sensitivity, which is admirable, right? That's a hell of a change to make at a major tournament.
Yeah, especially at a major, as you said, where you normally don't want to be making big risks like that. But with his hand injury, I think obviously the thing he's trying to do here is make sure he can play for as long as he can, and that's actually not a bad way to do it if you're changing the muscle you're working there.
Yeah, absolutely. And just last question before we wrap this up, we have to talk about Ninjas in Pajamas again, because this was a dominant performance. They beat Virtus.Pro 2-0. They had to grind it out a little bit, but 2-0 speaks volumes. Got past Godsent 2 maps to 1, and then of course got to the grand final and just kind of shut Na'Vi down. That second map, I think, on Cobble, wasn't pretty to watch. We've talked about them feeling more confident. We've talked about the impact Threat have had. I mean, everything was clicking for them on this playoff bracket. Everything that we talked about, I think it's fair to say, was coming together, right?
No, 100%. These guys definitely showed up. And like I said, the increased performance that we had seen now carrying into this event as an entire team finally blossomed into these huge individual performances there too. I think like 3 out of 5 of them all ended up with above a 1.10 player rating and whatnot versus the Virtus.Pro matchup. And we saw some huge performances from Exist in a lot of his games. So definitely everybody stepping up on this team. The question now, of course, after this tournament becomes, does this continue? I think the next big event would be the ESL Pro League finals. Are we going to see, assuming I think they're safe to make it into that. Assuming we see them go to that one, are we going to see a similar performance again? Or are we going to start to see some of the awkwardness happen that we've seen in some of these more recent lands of the past, like we saw back at the major too? That's been an issue for them. They've had one good event. Now the question is, will this continue for multiple events?
Last but not least, I've got some quickfire questions for you, Blue. So, quick as you can, give me your thoughts on the following news stories from the week. First off the bat, Desi is out and Hades is in for Team Winterfox.
I think Winterfox is probably just experimenting with new options at this point too. Hades, I wouldn't necessarily say he had been like a 100% standout player previously. It's sort of like one of those pickups when you look at Ustila that was recently brought in for the Renegades, where he's not this 100% solid player, but maybe the other teammates have talked with him about this one and they want to try him out of the roster. Desi, his individual performances, unfortunately, it's been incredibly hit or miss. Just to say the least. There's been games where he's gone completely off the wall and just absolutely destroyed the enemy team and carried his team single-handedly on his back, but there's been other games where he's at the bottom of the scoreboard, only racking up like 3 or 4 kills for the entire match. That inconsistency just is not going to do, and like I said before, I think Winterfox is just looking to experiment with other options right now.
Absolutely, and Freakazoid has left Cloud9's active roster, and Adren has stepped in to try out.
Well, actually, this is going to change now, too, because Adren's recently said, and this is like on the top page of Reddit right now, that Adren actually is not going to be joining C9. So this is a bit interesting to see what's actually going to happen with that 5th player there. But Freakazoid stepping out, it was basically inevitable that there was going to be a change within C9. The only question was who it was going to be, and in this case, it just ended up being Freakazoid. Obviously, his performance we had slumped down. He's not the only one. This is the thing too, is he's not the only one that has been slumping quite a bit with his individual performance. But I think again they're just looking to try and see who else they're going to bring in. As far as who they're actually going to fill in their 5th, I have absolutely zero clue. There doesn't really seem to be anybody else out in the open yet. There's a couple rumors floating around, but I don't want to put those out there until we know that those actually have some factual basis to them.
That's it for this week. I'm Jack Westerman, joined by John Blue Mullen.
We'll be back next Wednesday with another episode of PopFlash.